Hello, welcome to our virtual Talk About It series with Clear Recovery Center. I am Tessa Garner, Parent Engagement Coordinator at Beachley's Health District, and I am very happy that we have Gail Dargell with us today, and we have Howard Barker as well from Clear Recovery Center. And I did want to let everybody participating know that we are recording this, so you can access it at a later date. And Gail, take it away.
Awesome. So guys, it's so great to be here. I've been working with our teams for quite some time now, and I think just Clear Recovery in general, when I first started working here, I came in and I assessed the teen track and I was trying to see if it was a good fit. And I remember being in awe of the work that the teens were doing and the level of insight that they had and what they wanted to get out of treatment. And I think that's something that we have to foster. And I think that's, all ties back into this, let's talk about it. It's really about nurturing those connections and being able to have those really difficult conversations that I think almost every parent is fearful of having. We have a Monday night family meeting, and this has been a topic that we've been talking about for quite some time, is how do we have those really difficult conversations with our teens, and really how to acknowledge what are our own fears that are coming up that might get in the way of having those conversations. And I know that teens, they can feel it. It's like they have a sixth sense for a parental fear, and they can just sense it. And so much of it is really being attuned to ourselves and being mindful of what's happening on an internal level before we even broach those conversations. I think what I notice a lot of our parents struggling with, and it really depends, because on the teen track we have people that are working with primary substance abuse, primary substance abuse, and then primary mental health. And at the end of the day, we're still working on the same root, right? So the same root is maybe low self-esteem, maybe depression, maybe anxiety, low impulse control, right? Poor frustration tolerance, all those things are underneath it. But for our primary substance abuse users, there's something on top of that root, right? So we have to really address that before we can get to the root cause. And I think so much of our parents want to jump to that root first, but they're also very terrified of the substance abuse, right? So I get a lot of parents when they first come in, they're terrified. Maybe they've been down a really difficult road, and every move their teen makes, they're watching, and they're trying to make sure that they're not going to slip back. And when it comes to nicotine, it's like all alarms are going off in our parents' minds. Oh no, we're back there. Or maybe the nicotine is the first and foremost thing that's going on, and our parents, those alarms are going off. Okay, this is the gateway. This is where they're going to start using substances. What does that look like? And so I think all of that is really connected to paying attention to what's happening for you here, because that's always our first step with the parents, is what's happening for you right now. What's the root issue? What might be on the top of that root issue that we need to work on first? So I know there was a couple things that we wanted to talk about, one of which is definitely mindful parenting, what's coming up for our parents. I also wanted to talk about what is developmentally appropriate for our teens, and generationally what we're going through that's different compared to prior generations because of technology, because of social media, and really paired with that developmental milestone, it can be a dangerous mix, right? That combo. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit. I'll also be kind of discussing some trends that we're noticing in the South Bay with substances, the most common forms of substances that we're seeing our teens use, what our successful parents have done, what they've gone through, and kind of what that trajectory looks like, and how we support that on a Clear Recovery level. I'll also be discussing attachment styles in parenting. A little bit of what I was alluding to in the very beginning about what's coming up for our parents, right? That mindful parenting. We have some parents that are run a little bit more anxious, and we have some parents that are a little more hands off. And so it's really kind of that happy medium, that balance of where you can allow your teens to grow and to be, but while still being available when they get in trouble and not judging and condemning. So kind of get to that. I got a little list here. So I want to make sure I cover all the topics. And then I think, and then, oh, obviously I wanted to talk a little bit about COVID and how that's, affecting our families, especially with nicotine. So out of all of the topics that I just listed, do any of you guys prefer to get to anything in particular that you might find interesting or find that, our community might be interested in?
Well, I do actually. Gail, one thing that I liked that you brought up was kind of this imagery of like the root cause and how we really, really want to address it. And I should also introduce myself. My name's Jade McKnight. I am the Substance Use Prevention Program Coordinator and Youth Services at Beach Cities Health District. And so I'm really happy to be here and to talk about some of the patterns that we're seeing with the kids that we're working with it, whether it's Youth Advisory Council or just coming into contact with in other channels that we've worked with some students locally. So back to Gail's point about the root causes, and I really like this kind of like top down approach, but also kind of like bottom up. Yeah. Because we all know, I mean, in this field, we know that the real issue are the root causes, but in order to get down to that root, there's so much digging that we have to do. And so I feel like, and from conversations that I've had with students and with parents, both are kind of at this standstill on where do we start? Because sometimes parents want to jump into the hard part and they say like, I know our divorce is what it is. They know, they're just so, they know that's what it is. But for the kid, it could be something completely different. It could be a school thing, a personal thing. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, in your experience, you've seen both parents and students kind of attack the issue from either end, whether that is a top-down approach by kind of chugging away and digging deeper, 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 or if it's just right into the bottom and then just try to blow the whole thing up.
Oh gosh, that's a great question, Jade. I would say that happens daily, almost, especially when our teens first come in, our parents are like, this is what's going on. And, this is everything that's happened. Here's the timeline of their life. And all of that is so beautiful and so important for us to know. But at the end of the day, it's the buy-in from the teen, right? It's all about what does the teen think is the issue, right? Like, because when we can get in with the teen, then we can navigate up, right? We can navigate down. They will take us where we need to go. But oftentimes when we try to label this is the root problem, maybe it is, but maybe we got to wait for the teen to kind of navigate and direct us to get there, because there's so many defenses that come up, right? And most times, I think the most difficult thing with teens is they don't know how to verbalize it. They know, I feel very overwhelmed and I feel suicidal. Like that is also a very common thing that we're experiencing is teens go straight to that. And we're already developmentally in this very like black and white cognitive state of mind where it's either all good or it's all bad, right? So when life gets troubling, part of what we have to do with them is teach them the gradations of emotions, right? I can be excited and I can be nervous and then I can be really afraid, which all feel kind of similar. Like when we think of like a horror movie, there's a lot of all those emotions coming up. But maybe for a teen, they don't realize that all of those things are happening compounded. They just go to, I'm overwhelmed, this is too much, and then maybe even I'm suicidal, I need to check out, right? So much of the work is really kind of, I know we talk about that top down, bottom up approach. So now this is almost going back to that bottom down or bottom up approach where we're working really with what's the emotion, how do we label it, what does that look like, what does it feel like in your body? Because it always comes down to the emotional regulation of the teen. And, I think we were all there at some point. I remember when I was first starting to work with the teens, and I've done a lot of work with adolescents and younger children. But really, before I started coming here, I had to do a lot of mindful work for myself and go, okay, where were you at when you were 13? Where were you at when you were 16? Because I think, just like you said, Jade, our parents might see the problem, but it's when we really get back into what was happening in our lives back then, emotionally, on a friend level, that's when we can get to like the real meat of the issue. And that's so much of our work, is really helping the parents to kind of peer in to the teen more, right? It's almost like changing their scope and their, because they're so big picture that we're kind of bringing them back in.
Right. And looking at the teen as opposed to looking at the issue, which can overwhelm everybody.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Gail. That's great.
Yeah.
I love that. Let's see, another thing that you brought up that I want to chat about, and I think that a lot of parents would benefit from, is just kind of if you could tell us about, your experience as a provider, and then having kids come and talk about, their parents might be part of their triggers, and their, how does that work? Because like we spoke about, the root causes can be so many things, and again, they can have a lot of different branch outs, for lack of a better phrase, but having, and especially when we're layering, we're stuck at, we were speaking about this a little earlier, that a lot of times the issues that are causing our teens to get involved in risky behaviors or, experiment with substances are home-based. So maybe if you could talk about how, for parents and kids, how when there's some tension, how do we kind of work through that in-house when we're not necessarily engaged?
Oh my gosh. Well, that was like, that was really stepping into COVID when we moved to Zoom. That was so much of what we were doing. It was, so we had changed basically our whole treatment approach with the teens because, when they were coming on site, they were doing 3 groups a day. There was, intermittent activities that were happening. We would have dinner with them. And then when COVID happened, when we went all to our virtual program, it was doing therapy via Zoom groups, right? But then that we also had our individual therapy paired with family therapy. So we had one session, which would typically just be their individual work with their therapist, but we did have to pair it with like 30 minutes of parenting as well. We also had another, I think we had some extra time with our case managers where they were spending more time with the families. But so much of the time, what we're doing on a treatment level is we're really helping the parents to see, look, let us hold the heavy stuff. Let us do the heavy lifting. You just be here. Let us in, tell us what's going on, and we'll kind of be the hands and the feet. We'll help to organize that. We'll help them to understand what is their part, what do they need to own in it, because I think that's where things get really, really difficult. And kind of talking a little bit about like the relationship. I think so many of our families, they're used to having one type of dynamic in the relationship, and that's heavy conversations all the time. And I think what the real issue is parents miss their child, right? They long for that teen to be that 7-year-old that they remember, or that 5-year-old who's sweet and gentle and playful, and they're not those guys anymore. They're not. And so I think so much of it is the parent really trying to pull them back into that role, when this is the time when teens are like, they are meant, on a healthy level, we are meant to individuate. We are meant to differentiate from our families. And so when we have that, when we have maybe more of an anxious attachment style, our parents are pulling us in. And as the teen is trying to pull out, then they might really actually start reach for drugs, right? Because we already have this like developmentally appropriate, like there's it's the time for novelty seeking. It's developmentally appropriate for them to be rebellious because they're differentiating. It's appropriate for them to go, I don't really agree with that. It's all appropriate for them to be all about their peers. Like that, if they weren't, then there's something going on, right? And now if we pair that with a parent that's really anxious and really terrified, and a lot of times we're kind of tying in that mindful parenting, right? Is a lot of times it's also the parent's identity has become wrapped up in being a parent. And now they have this teen that is growing and developing, and there maybe doesn't feel like much of a need for the mother or for the father for them to do things as much. And there's some grief and loss in there. And that's also going to be part of what the teen is feeling in the home, maybe the tension they're feeling, right? So we might be very cognizant of that on a treatment level, right? Where our teens are saying, this is what's happening at home, and maybe this is the energy that's happening. I think we're also very aware that teens can be a little manipulative, right? Like they know what they want, they know how to get there, you know, they're not all angels, right? But when we think about teens, it's really, I try to take out the word manipulation and I try to see it more like this is how they organize their world. This is how they see their world, this is how they organize their world. Because when we look at the prefrontal cortex, when we look at the brain, when we look at development, they're not where we are, right? They're not where their parents are. So their parents, you know, they're still in like theory of mind development where they're thinking of themselves, they're thinking of everybody. Jade, you know this, right? And that starts when we're really young at like 4 or 5 years old. And maybe this is like silly, but I remember when I was learning about theory of mind, I was like, oh yeah, I remember the exact moment when that clicked for me. And I was probably like 4 or 5. Now, I don't know if this is like a real thing or I'm trying to make it real. But I remember it was this shift I had in my mind because I was always hungry as a kid, like still am as an adult, right? But it was like I realized that not everybody was thinking what I was thinking and wanted what I wanted. Our teens are still in that moment. And so we got parents who are like, what are they thinking? How are they not putting our family, you know, first and seeing this whole big picture? Well, that's just not where they're at developmentally, right? So theory of mind, do you experience some of that, Jade, working with your teens and families?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that you brought that up because when I think about kids and the teens and how adults try to relate to teens, it's so much like, you know, it's hard because the generational divide is just that, you know, we are, you know, we like a, you know, that 30-27 threshold is just kind of like a whole nother age. You're completely concerned with other things. And parents and teenagers is a very hard connection to make sometimes. And so with our students, you know, they are fairly open and they'll explain, you know, it's hard to relate to my parents on any number of things, but when it comes to those conversations about substance use and the way that a parent might think it's a good way to address the topic or the elephant in the room, or the have you ever tried question, or are your friends doing this question. And so, you know, we often see kids just shutting them down and being like, I don't want to talk about this. It's not going to happen. But that's kind of where those divides start happening. That's where they're like stuck, you know. They're just it's interesting to hear them say, you know, I don't feel comfortable talking about it, but I don't have any other adults in my life to talk about it. So, you know, I often I look forward to the time when we have space for kids to just kind of question things publicly in a community setting, simply because it's very hard to have those questioning conversations with your parents, even if you haven't done anything, as we know, you know. So I think that'll, you know, that just hopefully will aid parents in, you know, just on everyone's time. It's a hard conversation all around to broach the subject of substance use. And your kids are probably just as terrified as you are. So I think that's another piece that we often forget, that the kids are going through it too. Whether their exposure is high or low, they're still trying to figure it out.
Well, absolutely, Jaden. I think you bring up such a good point is, you know, just relationally, we're in a different place when it's our, like, so I'm a therapist. I could never do therapy on a family member or a friend because I'm too close. So having those conversations with teens is really hard for parents because they're so close, right? Like for parents, it's danger. So teens don't necessarily have the comfort and the safety of really like curiously exploring some of those topics in a safe environment. Whereas where they're probably exploring those topics are with teens that are just as curious. And are, novelty seeking and want to try different things,
Right.
So, and I think part of how we work with that here is our case managers are pretty, and I think that is, they're almost, the kids kind of say they're kind of like a homie, it's really cute. They're like my homie Isabel, or Austin, and I feel like they can talk about some of those things with what feels like a peer, what feels like with somebody who's not going to judge them. And I think they often think that their parents are judging them, but I think judgment feels a lot like anxiety. Judgment feels a lot like fear. And then so we talk about the front end and the back end work, right? So the front end is the things that are kind of coming up and what they're working on a treatment level, right? And then the back end is like, these are some things, some issues that we're seeing that we need to interweave in our groups. So in our clinical, I'm always thinking, well, what are the themes? What are some of the themes that we're hearing from the struggles of our teams? And then we make groups about those themes. And then we have our family group about those things as well. So we're not necessarily saying, this is what your teen is saying, but we're having a parental discussion about, okay, what do we do when this happens? And on a parent level, how do you discuss these things? What are your fears? What are your concerns? All of that.
Yeah, that sounds great, because that really improves that like holistic wraparound service that, most families, when they find themselves in the situation, will need. That's great.
One thing I'd love to I think to talk about a little bit, and really love to hear you kind of talk about, Gail, is so with all that being said, and with that kind of perceived disconnect that can sometimes exist with parents, especially in a time like now where a lot of parents are dealing with just much more proximity to their teens. How do you navigate just the aspects of regular life that are now being rubbed up against you? And we can specifically talk about things like vaping and substance abuse where that is present, but also just other aspects, and I'd love to hear kind of what we think the right approach is to when you have a young person in your home that is vaping, and now all of a sudden it's not something you can kind of turn a blind eye to. What does the prevalence of that kind of stuff look like amongst kids now that, is it becoming more prevalent now that, with Corona, all the litany of things that are going on in the, public discourse right now. And so yeah.
Definitely. Well, yeah, we recently had a teen. So when we were doing our groups online on the virtual platform, right? So sometimes the teens, I mean, we can only do so much. So much of our program is about psychoeducation for our teens. It is about helping them to recognize, why did I turn to that? What was it for me that was causing me to seek the marijuana or to seek the nicotine? Was it my anxiety? Was it my depression? Was it my ADHD? Was I bored? Was it for social connections? And we had one group where I think it was a lot more prevalent when we were on site. When we were on Zoom, what would happen sometimes is we would see a teen sneak a vape, and they would vape. And then our therapist had said, look, you can't do that. We don't stand for it. And I guess he walked out and vaped in the hallway of his home and set off the smoke detector. So it wasn't funny when it was happening, but it actually was a really beautiful experience for the parents. And it helped us work with the parents, because automatically the parents, that's part of the work, I think, is parents want to jump to these kind of big consequences. And so it's immediately like, you don't have your phone for 2 weeks, right? Because phones are leverage, right? Going out, it's all leverage. And we want to work with leverage to some degree. But at the end of the day, we want to help teach the lesson. And so really the lesson that our teen needed to really learn in that moment was about respecting their home, respecting his parents, and the trust that was just newly established in the relationship, right? So those are the big things that we had to target with that. And it gave us an opportunity. So one of our clients ended up writing a process paper about, what does that look like? How is this showing disrespect to my family, disrespect to my home, disrespect to the place that is supposed to be the most sacred and safe place for our family to come back to, especially during these times. So I would say, that's something that we're really doing, is we're really helping the parents to find consequences that are, I don't want to say the other ones are not appropriate, but they're not really getting to the lesson, right? And the lesson at the end of the day is helping your parents to see that you're going to make the right decisions. Like at the end of the day, like that's what so many of our teens are working on right now, is they're trying to have a corrective experience with their parents because they've broken down so many walls of trust with them. So I would say it's come up a few times virtually. Prior to that, we had a lot of vaping where teens were trying to sneak it in. When they come into our site, we check their pockets. We make sure that they don't have any like puff bars. They have a lot of like, there's all these different ones like Juul puff, all these different things that they're using these days. And so they just already know they don't bring it on campus. It's not allowed. If we get it, we take it, it's ours. Like it's going in the trash. So they're learning from us that it's not something that we are condoning. And at the end of the day, it's an illegal substance. It's illegal for them to be purchasing it and having it. And so we look at it as any other form of substance.
So with all that being said, let's say that you're a parent and your son or daughter hasn't made it to Clear Recovery Center yet at this point. And you find out that they're vaping, right? And it's the middle of this kind of pseudo stay at home that's still going on. What's the appropriate response? How do you deal with it? Maybe it's the first time they've tried to vape. Maybe you've had suspicions for a while. And how do you approach that while honoring all the other topics, all the other points that you brought up, but still maintaining that respect and also the focus on health too, right? Because in addition to the respect, it's like, well, we want you to be safe and healthy. We don't want you to be getting addicted to nicotine and smoking these unhealthy substances. So how do you kind of navigate that from that angle?
Absolutely. Well, I think it also depends on the age, right? So I think first and foremost, I would approach it and just say like, what's up, man? Like, I saw the nicotine, what's going on? I give them the opportunity to share it with me. What's up? I saw the nicotine, kind of call it for what it is. And then they might say, well, I this was the first time and I've never done it before, right? Then I might say, well, how is it helping you? Because at the end of the day, I don't think our teens are doing it because they want it to hurt them. Like in their minds, it's helping them in some way. It may not be correct, but they think it's doing something for them. So I would want to know, well, what is it doing for you? Maybe I wouldn't say helping you, but like, what is it doing for you? Like, why is it that you use it? Like, and I would almost maybe even kind of give them some options. Is it because of this? Is it because it's kind of cool? Is it, what is it? So I would allow them to kind of speak to that and just kind of sit with them in that before planning on what the consequence was for that. Then I would be meeting with anybody else that lived in the house that's an adult and kind of going over what the teen had just talked to me about. I would say, look, this is now ours. You got to go upstairs to your room. They can go and sit in whatever it is that they are feeling in that moment. And then I would game plan with my spouse or my partner and just say, look, how do we want to deal with this? There's different ways that we could, limit money for them, because I think with COVID, it's almost been like teens haven't been going out, they haven't been able to access it. If they are, I think we had one teen whose parents suspected that he had gone to a park and bought it off of a friend, but there was nothing in the room. There was nothing that they could find with him, having access to it. So I think it's been a little different with COVID, but I would restrict access to any money that they would be able to have to buy and sell them potentially. I would have a conversation with the teen. I think with our teens, just as much as we were talking about the emotions, Howard, where they're not really able to understand it as it's happening, we have to work on a concrete level with the Juuls or the nicotine, the e-cigarettes. Physically, what is it doing to their body? So it's kind of having those conversations with them about giving them the behavioral it's like the behavioral notions as to how it's a problem, because they're not going to be thinking this is messing with my moods, this is messing with my depression or my anxiety, which we know it does. We know it affects anxiety, we know it affects depression, we know it affects concentration and learning. It stunts brain development. Like, we know all those things, but those things do not compute to teen. They just don't work. They're not registered, and part of their development right now is no fear, right? Like, they're not thinking of consequences, they're not thinking of anything like that. So we got to hit them where it does affect them. So if they're in sports, right, like, well, if they're a swimmer, look, man, like, how's your breath been? I would be not telling them this is what's going to happen, but oh, that's interesting, because I know that, like, maybe for my friend who smokes, she would say it's really hard for her to work out, or it's really hard for her. Sometimes she's just sitting at home and her heart just it's really, really slow, or it's really fast, or she notices she starts to wheeze. So I would start throwing little things like that out there for them to start going, oh my gosh, that is happening to my body right now. Because those are going to be the things that they'll start to notice, not their moods, not their irritability. It's got to be concrete. And I would just start to put some of those things out there for them, restrict uh, access to money for them to be getting it. And then having those conversations where we're not shoving information down their throats out of fear. But it's got to be conversations. I like to think of it as like open-handed conversations, because when we're really worried and we really want the teen to get a message, that's oftentimes when they're not getting the message. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that, and I think it's important because, one of the most important things that I always like to say is, and I think you touched on it really well, but, and so did Jade for that matter, but right, teens and adults are operating from a totally different place. And that's not a bad thing, right? Developmentally, a teen's not supposed to be in the same place as an adult. And so you're not, I think a lot of times we hear, well, we just need to give teens all of the information and talk to them like they're adults and they're going to make the right decisions. And that's not really true, because they're not supposed to, because they're not adults. And so we have to be cognizant of that. And so I really like that you touched on that. Another thing I think is important to talk to parents about is, what are we seeing right now inside of the community? What's taking precedence in terms of use? We, not too long ago, there was a death as a result of fentanyl and he was actually a young adult who thought he was taking Xanax, and it was not real Xanax, and he ended up passing away. Recently, I know there was another kind of fentanyl related death in Manhattan Beach. And so again, I think a lot of times we're seeing these situations with young adults in their early 20s, but the gap from teen to young adult isn't that huge. And so I'd love to see kind of I know that we're aware of it, but I think it'd be helpful for parents to kind of have an understanding of what's going on right now inside of the community and things of that nature.
Wow. Well, I think generationally we have so much more access to things. I mean, you got Venmo, you got Snapchat. Like, so many of our teens can buy and sell and do things on a different level than they have ever been able to do before. And I think we're seeing addictions form. We have porn that's so much more easily accessible, drugs, nicotine. I mean, they don't have to go into a smoke shop to buy nicotine. They can buy it online. They can buy it on Craigslist. I think right now the biggest trends that we see, and it's scary, is I see a lot of hallucinogens in our teens. So there's a lot of teens talking about doing LSD, mushrooms. Weed is just so rampant. Like, marijuana it's almost every teen that comes in, and I want to say every teen that's substance. Marijuana is a guarantee. Like, it is 100%, it's already there. And then we have some teens that have taken it to the next level. I was just meeting with one of them, and I hear this very often. They look at psychedelics and hallucinogens as a form of kind of getting to know themselves and getting more insight as to who they are. And I'm like, well, why don't you just do therapy? Like, you don't have to do drugs to do that. But in their mind, this is generationally, it's almost like, I remember when I was in college, it was like, it was mushrooms, and it was acid, and it was marijuana. And that was in college. And that was like self-exploration and experimentation. But now we're seeing that with like 13, 14 high school students, right? And they don't have the impulse control. They don't. Well, it feels good, I'm going to do it again, and I need to have more. And it's very scary what it can do to the brain, especially at such a young age. And in those moments, I don't know how much insight is really being developed at that age, but I know that is so much of what our teens are saying that they're looking for. And it's tough. It's really tough to kind of get around that. So much of it is really helping them to understand that that's not normal, right? Like, coming into treatment is not necessarily something that you do if you're experimenting. Like, oftentimes our teens are like, there's, when they first come in for the assessment, like, it's not that big of a deal. And for some teens, like, for some of them, we're really catching it pretty early, and maybe it's just marijuana and they're using it, on a weekly level, and we can explore what does that look like. And then there's, like, it's always on a spectrum, right? There's some teens that are using it periodically, and it's more self-medicating behaviors, right? So they're self-medicating for their depression, they're ruminating thoughts. Maybe somebody with ADHD has been using it because it helps them focus because they're not on meds and they really need to be on the right medications. Different things like that. Or we kind of move to the other side of the spectrum where we got teens, which we do see, using marijuana during the week, and then LSD on the weekends, and ecstasy on the weekends, and drinking here and there. Like, I've actually, on a trend level, I don't really see drinking as much, but for me, generationally, in that age group, it was more alcohol and marijuana. So we see that over time, we have definitely taken a step up in the level of intensity of drugs that we're seeing with our teens right now.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And one other thing I wanted to point out that we kind of definitely notice, I started seeing it with our teens and with young adults also, probably a few years ago, as kind of cannabis legalization really took flight, and widespread cannabis use became pretty ubiquitous. And what I've seen happen is there's this disconnect, right, where what may be acceptable, and I use acceptable with quotation marks because that's obviously a very personal decision for every family and for every adult, but what may be acceptable or explainable or understandable for someone that's in their late 20s or early 30s, what be that, and I use those, and I'll tell why I use those ages in a second, but be that cannabis use, be that some of this more, exploratory psychedelic use, some of these other things, right? Well, just because there's a body of discussion surrounding whether or not that may be appropriate in certain situations, or whether or not that can be done in a responsible way. And I'm not here to comment on whether that is or isn't true, but there's a dialogue surrounding that, right? But the problem is that dialogue and the merits and the points of that dialogue don't apply to someone 13, 14, 15, 16, honestly, 17 or 18, right? And the problem is that what's going on in the prefrontal cortex in the brain at 17 or 18 is very, very different than what's going on inside of the brain at 27, 28, or 29. And so I've really seen this trend, and I'm sure you've kind of noticed it as well, Gail, but where teenagers and very, very young adults will kind of latch on to this dialogue, and they'll say, well, I'm going to identify with this, right? This self-exploration, these other aspects of these utilizing these substances, and nicotine falls in the same category to a lesser degree, right? But they latch onto this story, and unfortunately, it just doesn't apply, right? It's comparing apples to oranges, and that's a very difficult distinction because, again, developmentally as a teenager, I'm invincible, right? So, well, you're saying that it's not. First of all, I don't want you to tell me that I can't do something. I don't want you to tell me that because I'm a teenager, I'm too young, or my brain isn't in a good position, or X, Y, and Z. And second of all, I don't believe that those negative consequences are going to happen to me, right? But unfortunately, what we're seeing more and more and more of is this prevalence of teens with psychotic symptoms, with these teens that are having really poor reactions to these substances. And so, and again, I'll tell you, it wasn't that bad 5 or 6 years ago. So I've really seen an up ramp. And I think specifically in the South Bay, like you mentioned, there is this fixation with psychedelics and all these other aspects. And so, I think it's important to understand that just because a teen may latch onto this idea that, well, this is all about self-exploration or whatever it is. Okay, maybe so. Let's put that on the shelf and talk about it, 10 years from now when your brain's done developing and you're in a different place, right? And so just something that I've noticed a lot.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think that ties into generationally just the differences in generations because of the accessibility of, that's all over Instagram. You can find those stories, you can find those videos, you can find that on like Vice News, like you can find it anywhere is how they're working with couples, and maybe they're doing MDMA, different things like that. I mean, it's out there, the information's out there, and now we have developing minds that go there and they can get answers and they can look things up in a second, you know what I mean? And so they're accessing all this information, but don't realize their limitations from their own brain and body. I think a lot of what we try to do with our teens, because there's actually been, a good majority, I would say, of our teens have actually experienced psychosis, induced psychosis. And they talk about it on a group level. Well, what did that look like? What did it feel like? What were your thoughts? How were your thoughts different? What was the hospital like? Because I think all those things, our teens hear it so differently when it comes from their peer, like so differently when they talk about maybe having to get a shot of Thorazine. I think our teens call it the booty juice, right? So they can explain it and paint the picture for our teens on a totally different level than as parents than we can talk about with our kids, right? But we absolutely do see that, Howard. I remember when I was working at the hospital, I worked at a psych hospital, and I had one of my clients, bless her heart, she didn't know that she had a predisposition for bipolar. And she was smoking wax, marijuana every single day, which we know is a very, very high potency. She had induced mania, and she kind of was introduced to her mental illness in that moment. And I remember seeing her, and it was so sad, because she had no idea what she was playing with. For her, it was, I'm going to smoke some weed. It's not a big deal. Everybody's smoking these pens, these wax pens, shouldn't be anything different. And so much of that is kind of what we're also talking about with the teens is know your family history, right? Know what's going on a biological level. We have one of our great therapists, Cody. He does a group, and it's all about psychosocial. What's going on in your family? What's happening for you? But those aren't conversations that we have on a Wednesday night at dinner. We don't talk about those things that, maybe our Aunt Susan had, or, grandma may have had. It's just not part of our conversation. So I definitely think that's a big part of it, is the accessibility to the information that's out there, and our teens being eager. That's so much. I don't know if you guys remember that. Like, I wanted to grow up so bad. When I was 15, I wanted to be 20. When I was 13, I wanted to be 17. And I think that's also another part of it is there's still that exists with our teens. Like there is still that desire to be older than they really are, So that's a lot of what we're seeing. I'm also seeing a lot of validation seeking through social media. That's something that I've noticed a lot, and with our guys and our girls, but it's a struggle. There's dating apps that some of our clients are on, and that's been really hard. That's almost like another form of an addiction, because our teens it's almost like out of boredom. They go on Tinder, they go on Grindr, they're on these sites, and for them, it's a means for attention. It's a means for validation. It's meeting all these different things for them. They look older in their pictures. Maybe they're attracting older people. So, oftentimes we're talking about, everybody, it's natural for us to want to be desired or to want to be wanted. That is normal. But to go to all these lengths and measures and putting ourselves in like really dangerous and precarious situations at such a young age, it's just really scary. So I think that's also another trend that I'm seeing with our teens, also somewhere where they're getting some of the drugs, as well as on dating apps. So I think that's also something for our parents to be aware of. The ways we have conversations about it, it's not you need to get off of that. It's really helping them to understand what, kind of like when Howard, you said, how would I have that conversation with the teen, is what is this doing for you? It's really helping them to develop more of an understanding. We call it like frank ignorance, like where I'm going to be asking questions to get them to get to the answer for themselves. I'm not going to tell them the answer of this is why this is bad. So I think that's another thing that we definitely see with our teens. And at the end of the day, just in thinking of like tying all this together, I know we've talked about a lot of things, and I really hope that this discussion doesn't bring on more fear for parents that are listening, and more anxiety. I think at the end of the day, it always comes back to the relationship, right? Like being able to have a relationship where you can have those conversations and notice what's coming up for you, and call it out for your teens, like, wow, this is crazy, this is kind of scary for me. It normalizes the person in the relationship on the other end. And I think developmentally, as much as we're talking about the teens differentiating and being independent individuals, it's also as parents about teaching your teens and your kids these things early on. And it's about the morals and the values that we really pour into them, and they have to make those decisions on their own, as scary as it is. Do you guys see much of that, Jade, in your work?
Yeah, that's really well. I think it all comes back to opening that door and just allowing your kid to kind of walk in, whether they walk in, slam the door behind them, or bust the door open, or gently take a couple steps. So it's tough because as parents, obviously, forever, as long as you're alive, as long as your child is alive, you're going to want them to be as healthy and happy as possible. But with all of these extenuating circumstances, all of this information, and a lot of, I don't want to say noise, but a lot of extra things that really have the potential to veer you off of your path, or just veer you just off the beaten, just somewhere else. And, I think it's our job as providers, as community members, as parents, and as non-parents, adults, for kids, for teens. It's our job to, create as safe of a space as we can, so that it's easier for them to walk through the door and talk to us, or, just to start the conversation. So it's really nice that we have amazing people for like you guys at Clear to keep that door open and, welcome these kids in when they're ready to get some help. That's part of the battle as well, making sure that we can point our kids into those directions. If it's not a parent, if it's not, someone that we trust. So it's nice to create these spaces and create community, so that our kids feel safe to explore themselves.
No, thank you. And I love that you use that word, because I do think so much of it is a community effort, right? I think so much of this has to do with working together as a community. So much of it has to do with open lines of communication, not just with our own kids, but also with each other, as parents, as community members, as providers, and just really participating and being part of the solution overall, whether that's, underage vaping, whether that's substance abuse, whether that's mental health, every aspect. And I think that when we come together as a community and address those things, we're able to effectively navigate them, and we're not sitting there isolated. When we're on our own islands trying to deal with it, then that's when a lot of the problems happen.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Well, I really am so grateful that we had both you, Gail, and Howard here today to join us from Clear Recovery. And Jade, thank you for all of your great input as well. And we will be sending, we can send out some resources. So if you guys have anything that you want us to follow up with, we'd be happy to do that. We're also going to post this on the vchg.org/talk page so people will be able to view it. But I just want to say thank you so much again. Really appreciate your insight. And
Great
hopefully we'll do this
conversation.
again.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you for having us.
It was a pleasure, guys. Anytime. Do it again. All
Thank you. Bye.
right.
Bye.
Take care, guys.